Welcome to the second mini lecture for Chapter 11. In this mini lecture, we're going to look at nutrient cycles, specifically nitrogen, the nitrogen cycle, and then the carbon dioxide cycle. And so first off, what we really need to look at is how those elements, some of those elements will then have a really interesting relationship between the abiotic environment and the biotic environment. So we've talked about what the difference between abiotic and biotic is, and if you remember that abiotic is non-living and biotic is living. So how are those nutrient cycles interacted within the environment and within that agroecosystem? So nutrients are really important to understand, and the first thing that we need to understand is if that cycle is not disrupted, those nutrients will not be lost. And so that disruption happens by different ways, and we'll talk about them more in depth during class, but different ways that we have control of and some that we don't have control of. So obviously humans have definitely altered those cycles, and the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle are really good examples of how we have altered those cycles. And that's, again, we'll talk about that more in class, but we have definitely studied that and how those have altered each of those cycles. So the nitrogen cycle, what is it composed of? First off, it's composed of that atmospheric nitrogen reservoir. So if you really look at the way we use nitrogen, it's in the air and it's in form of an N2. We don't smell it, we don't taste it, it's colorless, and it has a chemical in action. So it's not relatively chemically inactive. It is chemically inactive. And so then organisms can't use that N2 or that nitrogen from the air. So what does it have to do? It has to have that limiting nutrient for all of those terrestrial ecosystems. And so we have to have that ecosystem for those plants to then help with that nitrogen cycle. So soil nitrogen is a very good example of that. That nitrogen will then go into that soil and then interact with those soil microbes, soil pores, and then be able to chemically be changed so that plant will then be able to use it by a way of liberation. So again, that nitrogen cycle is in the air, and again, we can't smell it, we can't taste it, it's odorless, and it's colorless. And so the three ways that it's converted into atmospheric nitrogen are these three ways: biological, atmospheric, and then industrial. So biological, there's a good graphic at the middle of this chapter in chapter 11, and it looks at how that atmospheric nitrogen coincides with the biological nitrogen fixation that happens, and we'll talk about that again in class. But one thing that I kind of want you to understand is that atmospheric nitrogen has to go through some sort of energy or biological cycle or rainfall to make all of that nitrogen cycle happen, which is really important. And then kind of the same look when you're looking at atmospheric fixation. Lightning that will then, for example, lightning that accompanies those thunderstorms will generate a pretty intense electrical energy, and that's a good reaction of that nitrogen as well. So we'll talk about more of that in class. So we know that plants get nitrogen obviously directly or indirectly from the biological and the atmospheric nitrogen that we talked about, but it's also through decomposition of that soil organic matter. And if you will take soils, you'll learn what an important aspect soil organic matter is, because it's going to be able to hold those nutrients into that soil, so that plant or animal will be able to digest it, or that plant will be able to bring it through its root systems. Obviously, those soils will contain inorganic and organic parts of nitrogen, depending on how you farm, how you ranch. And then microorganisms will then convert that nitrogen into some sort of organic or inorganic form of nitrogen. And then plants will then use it as inorganic forms as well. And we'll look at that chemical system in class this week. So the carbon cycle is very similar to the nitrogen cycle in terms of the way it works, but one of the thing that we need to kind of wrap our heads around is how those reservoirs then form. So this is within limestone, it could be in air, it could be in water, fossil fuels, and soils is a big one that you and I will focus on. Carbon fixation, like nitrogen fixation, is a process of converting something, but we're converting the carbon dioxide to an organic compound so that photosynthesis can then happen. So then it can all interact with the same growth and development of that plant. And so that's important to make sure that both the carbon and the nitrogen cycle are working, and you and I are not altering it in large ways. So this is an example of what that carbon cycle looks like. So you have that atmospheric CO2 obviously has to be there for photosynthesis to happen. That photosynthesis will then happen within that plant if everything is right. Once that plant is done maturing, that crop residue will then go down into that soil organic matter. It will decompose or decay depending on what it is. Then it will come into some sort of form of organic carbon and then be used again because of its decomposition matters. So biomes are really important to know because they're just the large term of environment. So we look at the natural ecosystems of communities of plants and animals. So we have four major biomes in North and South America. We have a forest, grassland, desert, and tundra. And you'll read a little bit more of those in your readings this week and a little bit in class.